Rather than a robe, she wore a simple navy coat, and that was exactly why he thought he could decide who she was. The marble steps of the Franklin State Supreme Court shimmered beneath the pale glow of an early spring morning as lawyers hurried through the security entrance carrying leather briefcases, reporters adjusted their cameras, and deputies quietly monitored the growing crowd gathering outside one of the most important hearings of the year. Most people kept their heads down, focused on schedules, deadlines, and the business of justice. But all it takes is one bad decision to turn an ordinary morning into a story no one will ever forget. Vanessa Carter walked toward the courthouse at an unhurried pace, blending into the steady flow of visitors. At 56, she carried herself with quiet confidence rather than visible authority. There was nothing flashy about her appearance. Her dark blue coat rested neatly over a cream blouse, comfortable low heels echoed softly against the stone walkway, and a slim leather portfolio rested beneath her arm. She greeted an elderly maintenance worker with a warm smile, paused to hold the courthouse door for a young law student balancing several heavy casebooks, and continued toward the security checkpoint without expecting anyone to recognize her. She preferred it that way. Titles could command respect, but character revealed it. Standing several yards away, Officer Daniel Brooks scanned the entrance with folded arms. He had built a reputation for trusting his instincts above everything else, and that confidence often blurred into certainty long before he knew the facts. His eyes settled on Vanessa. She was walking toward a restricted entrance normally reserved for court officials, yet she displayed no visible credentials, no security escort, and no obvious sign of rank. Instead of asking a simple question, Daniel made a decision. He stepped directly into her path, forcing her to stop. "That entrance isn't for visitors," he said loudly enough for nearby pedestrians to turn their heads. Vanessa offered a calm smile. "Good morning, officer." Her voice remained steady, almost gentle. "I'm expected inside." Daniel frowned. Expected by who? Several attorneys slowed their pace. A television cameraman instinctively pointed his lens toward the exchange. Vanessa answered politely. "The court." Daniel gave a short laugh that carried farther than he intended. Everybody suddenly has business with the court. A few uneasy glances passed through the growing crowd. Vanessa never raised her voice. She simply waited, her expression unchanged, as though patience had become second nature years ago. Daniel interpreted her silence as hesitation instead of confidence. "Identification," he demanded. "Now." Without argument, Vanessa reached calmly toward her portfolio, but before she could retrieve anything, Daniel lifted a hand, stopping her movement. "Actually, don't move until I tell you." The word settled over the courthouse plaza like an unexpected chill. Somewhere above them, an American flag drifted gently in the morning breeze. Nearby, a courthouse clock quietly marked another passing minute. Vanessa looked at Daniel with composed eyes that showed neither anger nor fear, only quiet disappointment. She glanced once toward the courthouse entrance, then lowered her wrist almost imperceptibly, brushing a fingertip against the face of an elegant watch. The motion appeared ordinary, almost accidental. No one watching paid it any attention. No one except a security specialist several blocks away whose encrypted monitor suddenly illuminated with a silent priority alert. Daniel remained completely unaware. He believed he was controlling the situation. He believed the woman standing before him was simply another visitor who had wandered into the wrong place. And as the first black SUV turned the corner 3 blocks from the courthouse, the distance between assumption and truth began shrinking faster than anyone standing on those marble steps could possibly imagine. The murmur that had filled the courthouse plaza only moments earlier slowly faded into an uneasy silence as more people realized the conversation was no longer a routine security check. Attorneys standing near the front steps exchanged uncertain glances. A pair of interns stopped halfway through the security line, their folders pressed tightly against their chests as they quietly watched from a distance. Even the reporters who had been preparing for the day's hearing instinctively shifted their cameras toward the growing tension near the restricted entrance. Vanessa Carter remained exactly where she was, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady, and her expression composed. She had spent decades inside courtrooms where emotions often determined the outcome long before facts had a chance to speak. Experience had taught her that patience was sometimes more powerful than the loudest argument. Officer Daniel Brooks, however, mistook that patience for hesitation. He folded his arms and took another small step forward, narrowing the space between them without ever raising his voice. "You are holding up court operations," he said firmly. "If you have legitimate business here, then prove it." Vanessa looked directly at him, neither challenging nor retreating. "Every person who walks into this building deserves to be treated with dignity," she answered quietly. "That includes those whose names you do not know." Daniel shook his head with a faint smile that suggested he believed he had already figured her out. "Nice speech," he replied. "But rules still apply." Nearby, an elderly attorney named Richard Holloway slowly removed his glasses. He had practiced law in the state for nearly 40 years, and something about the woman's calm presence felt strangely familiar. He studied her face for several long seconds, searching his memory, yet before recognition could fully arrive, another deputy approached from the opposite side of the entrance. "Everything all right over here?" the deputy asked. Daniel answered before Vanessa could speak. "Routine situation." She tried using the restricted entrance without clearance. Vanessa politely corrected him. "I attempted to enter through the designated entrance I have used for years." Daniel quickly interrupted. "According to me, you have not." The words carried farther than he realized. Several courthouse employees who had been unlocking side entrances suddenly paused. One court clerk frowned, whispering something to a colleague while discreetly looking toward Vanessa again. Across the street, inside a dark security operations vehicle parked among ordinary traffic, a quiet electronic tone sounded once. A technician glanced at the encrypted alert on his monitor, immediately recognizing the priority code attached to the signal. Without wasting a second, he pressed a secure communication switch. "Protective Detail Alpha, status verification required," he said calmly. 3 identical sport utility vehicles traveling downtown changed direction simultaneously. Their drivers spoke very little because every member of the team already understood the protocol. Back on the courthouse steps, Daniel remained focused entirely on the woman standing before him. He never noticed the subtle movement of several courthouse security officers who had quietly stopped their usual patrols. They were no longer watching Vanessa. They were watching him. Vanessa adjusted the leather portfolio beneath her arm and looked briefly toward the courthouse doors where another hearing was scheduled to begin within minutes. Time mattered inside every courtroom. Delays affected families, attorneys, witnesses, and entire communities waiting for justice to move forward. Yet despite the growing inconvenience, she showed no sign of frustration. Instead, she offered Daniel one final opportunity. "Officer," she said with genuine sincerity, "there is still time to handle this professionally." Daniel answered with complete confidence. "I already am." Around them, the morning breeze carried the distant sound of approaching engines, still too far away for most people to notice, but close enough that the next few moments were about to change the entire atmosphere outside the courthouse. The first black sport utility vehicle rolled silently onto the courthouse plaza, followed within seconds by 2 more, each stopping with quiet precision along the curb as if every movement had been rehearsed countless times before. Conversation stopped in mid-sentence. Reporters lowered their microphones for a brief moment before instinctively raising them again. The attorneys standing near the entrance exchanged puzzled looks because no one had expected a protective motorcade to arrive that morning. Officer Daniel Brooks glanced toward the vehicles, then quickly dismissed them. His attention remained fixed on the woman standing calmly in front of him. "Looks like somebody important is showing up," he said with a confident smile. "You should probably step aside before you create another problem." Vanessa Carter simply looked at him with the same composed expression she had carried since the beginning of their conversation. There was no anger in her eyes, no satisfaction, and no urgency. She had witnessed enough difficult moments throughout her judicial career to understand that truth rarely needed to announce itself. It only needed time. The rear door of the lead vehicle opened first. A man in a dark suit stepped onto the sidewalk, scanning the surrounding area with practiced professionalism. Another followed, then a third. None of them appeared hurried, yet every movement reflected years of disciplined training. Their attention settled immediately on Vanessa, not on the courthouse, not on the growing crowd, and certainly not on the cameras now recording every second. Daniel noticed them approaching and instinctively raised one hand. "Restricted area," he called out. "Hold your position." The lead agent acknowledged the instruction with a courteous nod but never slowed his pace. "Good morning, officer," he replied evenly. "We are here to escort Justice Carter." Daniel frowned, convinced there had been some misunderstanding. He pointed toward Vanessa without taking his eyes off the approaching team. "She is currently being questioned regarding unauthorized access." For the first time that morning, a faint expression of surprise crossed the lead agent's face. It lasted only a second before returning to complete professionalism. "Unauthorized," he repeated calmly. "Sir, she is scheduled to preside over this morning's constitutional hearing." Several people standing nearby inhaled sharply. Richard Holloway closed his eyes for an instant, finally recognizing the face that had seemed so familiar only moments earlier. One young law clerk quietly whispered, "That is Justice Vanessa Carter." The word spread through the crowd almost immediately, passing from person to person until dozens of quiet voices carried the same realization across the courthouse steps. Daniel stood perfectly still. His confident posture remained unchanged, but uncertainty slowly replaced the certainty that had guided every decision he had made since Vanessa arrived. He looked carefully at her again, noticing details he had completely overlooked before. The calm confidence. The familiar face seen countless times in legal publications. The unmistakable dignity that had never disappeared, even while being questioned in front of strangers. The lead agent reached Vanessa and offered a respectful smile. "Good morning, Your Honor. We apologize for the delay." Vanessa answered with the same quiet warmth she had shown everyone else that morning. "Good morning, Michael." "Thank you." She neither celebrated nor criticized what had just happened. Instead, she turned briefly toward Daniel. "Officer Brooks," she said gently, "every encounter is an opportunity to strengthen public trust. I hope today becomes one of those opportunities." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Around them, courthouse employees, attorneys, deputies, and reporters watched in complete silence, realizing they had not just witnessed a misunderstanding. They had witnessed how quickly assumptions could overshadow respect, and how quietly the truth could transform an ordinary morning into a lesson that no one standing on those courthouse steps would soon forget. The silence lingered long after the truth had settled over the courthouse plaza. Reporters who had arrived expecting another ordinary morning now stood motionless, their cameras recording something far more meaningful than a scheduled hearing. They were witnessing the difference between authority and wisdom, between assumptions and facts. Justice Vanessa Carter remained composed as Michael, the lead protective agent, quietly stepped beside her. The rest of the security detail formed a respectful presence rather than an intimidating one, allowing courthouse employees and visitors to continue moving through the entrance without disruption. Their purpose was not to command attention but to ensure that one of the state's highest judicial officials could carry out her constitutional responsibilities safely and without unnecessary delay. Daniel Brooks finally lowered his hand. The confidence that had once shaped every word he spoke had given way to visible uncertainty. He looked around the plaza, noticing expressions that had changed completely. Deputies who had worked beside him every week avoided meeting his eyes. Attorneys who had remained silent only minutes earlier now quietly exchanged thoughtful remarks. Richard Holloway adjusted his tie and walked toward the entrance, pausing only long enough to nod respectfully at Justice Carter before continuing inside. Daniel understood that everyone had seen exactly what had happened. No explanation could erase it. Michael calmly addressed him. "Officer Brooks, we appreciate your commitment to courthouse security. It is an important responsibility. But effective security begins with accurate assessment." There was no accusation in his voice, only professionalism. Daniel swallowed before answering. "I was following procedure." Michael nodded slightly. Procedure matters. So does recognizing the people you are sworn to serve. Vanessa listened without interruption. She had spent years reminding young judges that the strongest courtroom was one where everyone believed they would receive fairness before judgment. That principle did not stop at the courtroom doors. It began outside them. She stepped forward and looked directly at Daniel. "Officer Brooks, there is something every judge learns long before taking the oath." Her voice remained calm enough that those nearest had to listen carefully. "Every person standing before us carries a story we do not yet know. If we allow assumptions to speak before facts, justice loses its balance." The words settled deeply over the crowd. A young law student quietly lowered the notebook she had been holding, realizing she had just witnessed a lesson no textbook could fully explain. Nearby, one television reporter whispered to her producer, "Keep rolling." Nobody wanted to interrupt the moment because it no longer belonged to a single misunderstanding. It had become something much larger. Daniel looked at the marble columns rising above the courthouse entrance. He had worked outside this building for nearly 6 years. Every morning he passed beneath words carved into the stone facade that declared equal justice under law. He had seen them so many times that they had almost become invisible. Yet standing there now, those words felt different. They no longer seemed like architecture. They sounded like responsibility. Michael received a quiet message through his earpiece and gave a respectful nod toward Vanessa. "Your Honor, the Associate Justices have assembled. The hearing is ready whenever you are." Vanessa smiled gently. "Thank you." Before turning toward the courthouse doors, she glanced once more at Daniel. There was no anger in her expression, only quiet resolve. "Today is still an opportunity," she said. "What happens next is entirely your choice." Without another word, she entered the courthouse surrounded by neither applause nor celebration, but by something far more enduring. Respect earned through dignity, patience, and the quiet confidence that truth never needs to raise its voice to be heard. Inside the grand courtroom, the atmosphere returned to the disciplined rhythm expected of the state's highest judicial institution. Court officers quietly guided attorneys to their assigned tables while spectators settled into polished wooden benches beneath the high ceiling where generations of history seemed to watch every proceeding. The morning hearing involved constitutional questions that would affect thousands of citizens across the state, yet before a single argument could begin, another conversation had already started beyond the courtroom walls. It moved through hallways, security offices, reporters' phones, and courthouse elevators with remarkable speed. People were not discussing the legal case scheduled for that morning. They were discussing what had happened outside. Daniel Brooks remained near the entrance where only minutes earlier he had spoken with complete confidence. Now he replayed every word in his mind, searching for the exact moment when confidence had quietly crossed into assumption. The answer became painfully clear. It had happened long before he ever asked for identification. It had happened the instant he believed he already knew who Vanessa Carter was simply by looking at her. Deputy Laura Mitchell approached him carrying a small electronic tablet. She had worked courthouse security for more than a decade and understood that difficult conversations were sometimes the most important part of professional growth. "Daniel," she said calmly, "the Security Operations Center needs a factual incident report before noon." Daniel accepted the tablet without speaking. The blank report seemed strangely intimidating. Facts left very little room for interpretation. He would have to describe exactly what happened, exactly what he said, and exactly how the encounter unfolded. Every courthouse camera covering the entrance had recorded the entire exchange from multiple angles. There would be no uncertainty about the sequence of events. Across the building, Justice Vanessa Carter took her seat on the bench alongside her fellow justices. As the courtroom clerk called the session to order, every person inside rose respectfully. Vanessa looked across the courtroom with the same calm expression she had shown outside. Nothing in her demeanor suggested distraction or resentment. The responsibilities before her were larger than one uncomfortable encounter. Citizens had come seeking impartial justice, and that obligation deserved her complete attention. During a brief recess later that morning, Chief Justice Harold Bennett quietly joined her in the private conference room. "I heard about the situation outside," he said. Vanessa offered a thoughtful smile. "I imagine many people have by now." Bennett nodded. "Would you like me to address it publicly?" Vanessa paused before answering. "Not yet. Let the facts speak first. They usually do a better job than emotions." Meanwhile, in the courthouse security office, supervisors carefully reviewed the entrance footage. The video showed a woman approaching respectfully, responding politely, and remaining patient throughout the encounter. It also showed how quickly assumptions shaped the conversation before verification ever began. No shouting. No chaos. Just a series of decisions that gradually moved farther away from the professional standards expected inside one of the state's most respected institutions. Captain Elena Morris folded her hands as the recording ended. "This is why training exists," she said quietly to the room. "Not because mistakes never happen, but because every mistake teaches us whether we are willing to improve." Outside, the courthouse returned to its normal rhythm. Visitors continued arriving. Hearings proceeded according to schedule. Yet for everyone who had witnessed the morning unfold, the building somehow felt different. The marble columns had not changed. The courtroom had not changed. The law itself had not changed. What had changed was a simple reminder that respect is not reserved for titles after they are revealed. It is the standard every person deserves before anyone knows their name. By early afternoon the courthouse had settled back into its familiar rhythm, yet beneath the calm surface a different process had quietly begun. Justice inside a courtroom followed written statutes, carefully presented evidence, and constitutional principles. Accountability outside the courtroom followed a similar path. It started with facts. Inside the Security Operations Center, Captain Elena Morris convened a routine administrative review. There was no dramatic announcement, no public accusation, and no rush to conclusions. The entrance recordings from every available camera were synchronized on a large monitor while radio communications, access logs, and officer reports were assembled in chronological order. Every second mattered because every decision deserved to be understood in context rather than emotion. Daniel Brooks sat across the conference table with his completed incident report resting in front of him. He had rewritten several sentences before finally submitting it because the truth looked different on paper than it had inside his own mind only a few hours earlier. Reading his own words forced him to recognize how often he had described assumptions as observations. Captain Morris looked around the room before speaking. "This review is not about embarrassment," she said calmly. "It is about whether our conduct reflects the public trust placed in this department every single day." No one interrupted. The first recording began to play. The video showed Vanessa Carter approaching the entrance with measured confidence. It showed her greeting courthouse employees with kindness before reaching the security checkpoint. It showed Daniel stepping into her path. It showed her remaining respectful during every exchange. When the recording ended, Captain Morris allowed several quiet moments to pass before asking a simple question. At what point did verification stop leading this encounter? The room remained silent until Deputy Laura Mitchell answered. Before identification was ever requested. The conclusion came first. The facts came later. Captain Morris nodded. "That is exactly what concerns me." Daniel lowered his eyes. He wanted to defend his intentions, yet the recordings made one reality impossible to ignore. Intentions could never erase the impact of professional decisions. Across the courthouse, Justice Vanessa Carter completed the final matter on the afternoon calendar. As attorneys gathered their documents and spectators quietly exited the courtroom, she remained seated for a brief moment, reflecting on the responsibility carried by every public servant, including herself. Judges, deputies, clerks, and officers all represented the same system. Public confidence depended on each person honoring the same principles, even when nobody was watching. As she entered her chambers, Michael handed her a brief update. "The administrative review has already started." Vanessa thanked him before placing the folder unopened on her desk. "Good," she replied. "Then the process is working." She had no interest in influencing the outcome before the evidence had been fully examined. Fairness required patience, especially when the situation involved someone whose career could be shaped by the conclusions reached that day. Back in the conference room, Captain Morris closed the final recording and folded her hands. Policies exist to protect both the public and the officers who enforce them, she said. The moment assumptions replace impartial evaluation, everyone loses confidence in the system. Daniel slowly nodded. For the first time since the morning encounter, he spoke without defensiveness. I understand that now. His words were quiet, but they carried more honesty than anything he had said all day. Outside, the courthouse steps looked almost identical to how they had appeared that morning. People continued arriving, leaving, and moving through the doors beneath the engraved promise of equal justice. Yet for those who had witnessed the events unfold, those words carved into the stone no longer seemed like a distant ideal. They had become a daily responsibility that demanded humility before judgment and respect before assumption. The following morning arrived with the same golden light stretching across the courthouse steps, but for Daniel Brooks nothing felt familiar anymore. The entrance where he had confidently directed hundreds of visitors now seemed like a place where every decision carried far greater weight than he had ever realized. He reported for duty early, long before the first attorneys arrived, standing quietly beneath the stone inscription that promised equal justice under law. For the first time in years, he actually stopped to read every word instead of walking past it. The sentence had not changed overnight, yet its meaning had. Inside the administrative offices, Captain Elena Morris finalized the preliminary review. Every witness statement aligned with the security footage. Every timeline matched the recorded communications. The findings were neither exaggerated nor minimized. They simply reflected what had happened. Daniel had acted without verifying identity before forming conclusions, and his conduct had fallen short of the professional standard expected at the state's highest court. The recommendation focused not on punishment alone but on corrective training, policy review, and rebuilding public confidence. Captain Morris believed that accountability carried the greatest value when it created lasting improvement rather than temporary embarrassment. Later that morning, Daniel received permission to speak privately with Justice Vanessa Carter. If she was willing. He did not expect the request to be accepted. After all, she had every reason to decline. Yet shortly before noon, Michael escorted him to a quiet conference room overlooking the courthouse courtyard. Vanessa entered carrying a folder of legal documents, looking exactly as composed as she had the previous day. Daniel immediately stood. Your Honor, he began, his voice noticeably quieter than before, I came to offer an apology without excuses. Vanessa nodded gently, inviting him to continue. I believed I was protecting the courthouse, Daniel said. Instead, I allowed assumptions to influence my judgment before facts did. Watching the recordings forced me to see what everyone else already saw. I did not treat you with the respect every citizen deserves. Vanessa listened carefully without interrupting. Years on the bench had taught her that sincere accountability often sounded different from rehearsed regret. Daniel was not asking to erase the past. He was acknowledging it. After a thoughtful pause, she answered. Officer Brooks, our justice system depends on people who are willing to learn after difficult moments. Judges are not perfect. Officers are not perfect. Lawyers are not perfect. What matters is whether we choose humility when truth corrects us. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly before looking back at her. I intend to earn back the trust one damaged. Vanessa smiled softly. Then begin with the next person who walks through those doors. Treat them with the same dignity you would offer someone whose name you already know. Those words settled deeply into the room because they required no courtroom, no legal citation, and no formal order to carry authority. They reflected the very principle the courthouse had been built to protect. As Daniel left the conference room, he noticed visitors entering the building from every direction. Some wore expensive business suits. Others arrived in work uniforms, jeans, or simple everyday clothing. Parents held children's hands. Elderly couples walked slowly together. Young law students carried backpacks instead of briefcases. For the first time, Daniel understood that none of those outward details revealed who a person truly was. Respect could never depend on appearance because justice itself never should. And with that realization, the lesson that had begun on the courthouse steps finally became something far more lasting than a single unforgettable morning. Over the next several weeks the courthouse gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, but the lessons from that morning did not fade with the passing days. They quietly became part of the institution itself. Captain Elena Morris introduced additional professional development sessions for every member of the courthouse security division. Instead of presenting abstract policies from a handbook, the training focused on real situations, emphasizing careful observation, respectful communication, and the importance of verifying facts before reaching conclusions. Officers discussed how easily unconscious assumptions could influence decisions without anyone intending harm. The conversations were honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but always constructive. Daniel Brooks attended every session without missing one. He no longer sat in the back of the room. Instead, he volunteered to share his own experience, explaining how confidence without humility had almost convinced him that first impressions were enough. "I thought I was protecting the courthouse," he admitted during one discussion. "Now I understand that protecting the courthouse also means protecting the dignity of every person who enters it." His words carried unusual weight because they came from personal experience rather than theory. New officers listened carefully, recognizing that professional growth often begins with the willingness to acknowledge mistakes instead of hiding them. Justice Vanessa Carter continued her work much as she always had. Her courtroom remained a place where every attorney received the same opportunity to be heard, every argument was measured against the law rather than emotion, and every decision reflected the constitutional principles she had sworn to uphold. She never mentioned the incident during public hearings, never referred to it from the bench, and never allowed personal experience to influence judicial responsibility. Yet those who worked closely with her noticed that she continued greeting courthouse employees each morning with the same warm smile that had defined her long before the events outside the entrance. Respect, she believed, should never become conditional simply because someone else had failed to show it first. One afternoon a young law student named Emily Sanders approached her after observing oral arguments. "Your Honor," she said, "everyone talks about that morning outside the courthouse. They say you handled it with remarkable grace. How did you stay so calm?" Vanessa paused thoughtfully before answering. "Because institutions become stronger when people respond with principle instead of pride. If I had allowed frustration to guide me, the lesson would have become about personalities. It needed to remain about justice." Emily quietly nodded, realizing she had just learned something that would shape her future career far beyond anything found in legal textbooks. Outside, Daniel noticed the student leaving the courthouse and politely held the entrance door open for her. He did the same for an elderly veteran using a cane, a delivery driver carrying heavy packages, a family arriving for jury service, and a construction worker asking for directions. He no longer wondered who deserved courtesy. He understood that courtesy was the beginning of professional service, not the reward for someone's status. People passing through the courthouse rarely knew anything about the conversation that had changed his perspective, yet they experienced its results every day. One respectful greeting at a time. One careful question at a time. One fair decision after another. Without speeches, headlines, or public celebration, the culture surrounding the courthouse quietly evolved. Not because one difficult moment had embarrassed an officer, but because one difficult moment had reminded everyone inside that justice begins long before anyone enters a courtroom. It begins with the simple decision to see another human being before making assumptions about who they are. Several months later the courthouse looked exactly as it always had, its marble columns rising above the city skyline, its bronze doors opening each morning to citizens seeking fairness, answers, and hope. Thousands of people crossed those steps every week, yet very few knew that one ordinary morning had quietly reshaped the culture inside those walls. The greatest changes often leave no monument because they live in the choices people make every single day. Officer Daniel Brooks still reported for duty before sunrise. His uniform had not changed. His responsibilities had not changed. What had changed was the way he greeted every person approaching the entrance. Whether someone arrived wearing an expensive tailored suit, a restaurant uniform, worn work boots, or simple everyday clothes, Daniel welcomed them with the same calm respect. He asked questions without making assumptions. He listened before reaching conclusions. More importantly, younger officers began following his example. New recruits noticed that experienced deputies now reminded one another to verify first and judge later. It slowly became part of the courthouse culture, repeated often enough that it transformed from a lesson into a habit. Justice Vanessa Carter continued serving the people of the state with the same quiet integrity that had defined her career for decades. She never sought recognition for what had happened outside the courthouse because she believed the real victory belonged to the institution itself. Every improved interaction between an officer and a visitor represented something far more meaningful than personal vindication. It represented public trust growing stronger one conversation at a time. During a community outreach event held at the courthouse later that year, local high school students toured the building to learn how the justice system worked. One teenager raised his hand during the question and answer session and asked, "How can ordinary people help make justice stronger?" The room became still as dozens of students waited for the answer. Vanessa smiled warmly before responding. Justice is not built only by judges or lawyers. It is built every time someone chooses fairness over assumptions, respect over pride, and truth over appearances. Those choices belong to every one of us. Her words were met with thoughtful silence because they sounded less like a speech and more like a simple truth. As the students prepared to leave, Daniel held the courthouse door open for the group. One young visitor paused and quietly thanked him. Daniel smiled and replied, "You are always welcome here." The sentence lasted only a few seconds, but for him it carried the memory of everything he had learned. Michael watched from nearby and exchanged a brief glance with Justice Carter. Neither of them needed to say anything. They both recognized that meaningful change rarely arrived through dramatic moments alone. It endured through consistent character. As the afternoon sunlight reflected across the courthouse steps, people continued arriving from every walk of life, each carrying unseen responsibilities, private struggles, and personal stories that could never be understood through appearance alone. Some entered to seek justice. Others came to provide it. All deserved the same measure of dignity before a single word was spoken. And perhaps that was the quiet lesson hidden beneath everything that had happened. A badge may grant authority, a robe may symbolize responsibility, but neither has lasting meaning without humility. Because the strongest foundation of justice is not found in marble walls, official titles, or courtroom traditions. It begins in the simple decision to recognize the humanity of the stranger standing right in front of you, long before you ever learn their name.